Rated the memorable headline, Crisis? What crisis? After all, if one looks at the growth in the global economy, it's not exactly bad. India is powering ahead with growth forecast above 6%. The US economy is reaching new highs. The Indian stock market is not too far behind the US stock market. If this is a crisis, it's really not too bad, certainly by comparison with some of the crises we've seen in the past. But I think your question has to do with a crisis of international order. That, I think, one could certainly say exists, partly because of the re-election of President Donald Trump and his resumption of a trade war, not only against China, but against almost all US trade partners. But I think also because China has pursued a pretty aggressive industrial policy over the last decade or so, and that has created a great deal of stress and strain for other economies. So I think the crisis that we see today isn't an economic crisis. It isn't a financial crisis. Of course, it's not a public health crisis like the one we saw 5 years ago. It's a crisis of international order. And I would say that by comparison with the crises of the international system of the 20th century, it's still a manageable one because it's a crisis that's focused on tariffs and export controls, not a crisis that takes the form of large-scale military action, with the obvious exceptions of the conflicts we've seen in Ukraine and in the Middle East in the past few years.
Professor Ferguson, you've spoken about how presidents around the world, especially Donald Trump, has tried to vastly enhance his presidential power. To what extent will he be successful? And number two, how do you think Donald Trump's policies are likely to permanently impact how American governments, American presidents approach the world?
Well, I'm speaking to you today from Europe, and Europeans worry a great deal about President Trump. They have done ever since he burst onto the political scene 10 years ago. And their worry is that he wants to be an emperor or a dictator. And you hear similar fears expressed on university campuses in the United States, at Harvard or at Stanford, where I'm normally based. I think many of these fears are exaggerated because I don't see President Trump being able to overthrow the Constitution or even constitutionally get himself a third term, which would have to be through a constitutional amendment. He is quite constrained, as previous presidents have been constrained by the separation of powers, which limits the power of the executive branch, as well as by the realities of economics and politics. His approval rating is in the red relative to where it was when he was sworn in. I don't expect Republicans to do well in the elections we're seeing this week, and I don't expect that they'll do particularly well a year from now in the midterms. So I think those people who think that the Republic, the American Republic, is on the brink of collapse are being realistic. I think they're underestimating the checks and balances designed not only by the founders, but also developed over nearly a quarter of a millennium, 250 years of the American Republic.
When it comes to the competition between India and China, how do you think that's going to play out for the future? The reason why I ask, we've seen a trade war between US and China, and after every 3 months, there is an extension of the truce. When it comes to the competition between India and China, you've previously written and said it's like a race between the tortoise, which is India, and China, the hare. China's running too fast, and one day the tortoise will catch up. What do you think India needs to do in order to be a global leader and catch up with China?
It's certainly very striking how well the Indian economy has performed since I said that. And I think it's as long ago as 2008 that I predicted that, as in the fable of the tortoise and the hare, that ultimately India would catch up with China. The reason I believe that is not only the demographic difference, where you can see China's population aging and shrinking very much in contrast with India's, and it's not just because of the very clearly different economic strategies they're pursuing. It's also because India is a free society. It has a free press. It has the rule of law. It has elections. And it's in that sense in a much stronger position than a one-party state in which there is an unaccountable party above the rule of law, and in which you can never really feel secure in your property rights. So I take the view that India has a fundamental institutional advantage. And since I made that prediction back in 2008, you can see India's growth rate has gone up and China's has come down. There's really now quite a significant difference, especially if you're skeptical about China's growth data, which I increasingly am. So my sense is that with India growing above 6% and Chinese growth probably heading down towards the low single digits, there's going to be a sustained catch up. Now, India has a long way to go, and that's very obvious when you look at the manufacturing data. China is a manufacturing superpower. It's number one in manufacturing, far ahead not just of India, but also of the United States. In fact, it's close to having twice the manufacturing value added of the United States. So there's a long way to go for India to catch up in those terms. But in other terms, if one looks at the economy more broadly, I think there's a lot of potential for India still to catch up. The obvious way in which India can strengthen its growth is not just to continue improving its infrastructure. It's been doing that for some time, but also to keep working at education, because one of the obvious differences between India and China is that while elite education is very good in India, primary education is not. And in that basic way, India's human capital lags behind China's. And if there was one thing that I would recommend that Indian policymakers focus on, it's just improving the quality of education at the lower social levels so that the average Indian is just better educated than is currently the case.
You're very right, Professor Ferguson. But I would also like to ask you about the long-term vision that a leader should have. I'm speaking about Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He has a vision of India becoming a Viksit Bharat, a developed nation by 2047. Is there an example that he could follow? What do you think the Prime Minister of India should have as its vision?
Well, I think it's important to give Prime Minister Modi his due. He has succeeded where previous prime ministers failed in getting India's economy to overcome what seemed previously to be insuperable barriers. When I first went to India and traveled widely there, now more than 20 years ago, there was a general view that you would never really overcome the bureaucratic and political barriers that stood in India's way, that the infrastructure would somehow never get upgraded, and therefore there would never really be sustained high-level growth in India. That has been radically changed in Narendra Modi's premiership. But as I said already, there's a long way to go. And targets like 2047 are somewhat arbitrary. The key question in my mind is how far the government can work to improve those foundations of prosperity that are so indispensable. I mentioned education already. The other one is public health. Rural poverty remains a reality in significant parts of India. There are, in a sense, two Indias. The India of Bangalore or of Mumbai, which when one visits today feels like first world India. But then another India which remains rooted in a past of rural deprivation. It's a hugely difficult thing to tackle, but we know from the experience of other Asian economies that it can be done. And so I think the big challenge for India is not to reinvent the wheel, but actually just to learn best practice from other successful Asian economies. And I don't think China is necessarily the role model, because I don't think it's appropriate to copy China. Far too much power is in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and state-owned enterprises. Better, I think, to look at some other Asian economies that have modernized as democracies. South Korea, for example, is a pretty impressive role model and a place that I think increasingly has set a standard for how an Asian economy can economically modernize and politically thrive as a democracy. So my sense is that India still has some straightforward, low-hanging fruit to grasp. It's just a matter of a sustained effort to improve education, public health, and reduce the poverty of rural areas.
Professor Ferguson, I'd like to ask you about the trends that we see today. There is a AI-related disruption. There are trade wars going on. We're seeing inflation cycles. What permanent shifts do you expect in the world order?
Well, I would think of the world as being in a second Cold War. I think that's been true since 2018, if not earlier. And that's because China has essentially taken on the role that the Soviet Union played in the first Cold War. That is to say, it's the communist-led authoritarian regime which is challenging the United States and its allies technologically, ideologically, and geopolitically. And the situation of so-called middle powers, such as India, or for that matter, the European Union, is how do you adjust to a new Cold War? We had a very pleasant interwar period from 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed until around 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power in Beijing. We think of that as an era of globalization. It's clear that we're living through a period in which globalization is in retreat, partly because of tariffs, but also because I think there's been a general backlash against globalization. If you think about the world in that framework, then it's clear that India has a different strategy from its strategy in the first Cold War. In the first Cold War, the Indian position was, we're not aligned. We don't really want to be caught up in this superpower conflict. We'd like to be, in a sense, aligned with neither superpower. In more recent times, in this second Cold War, India has tried to be, in some ways, aligned with both. I've called it the polyamorous strategy. And I can remember Minister Jaishankar boasting a couple of years ago at the Munich Security Conference about India's ability to have it both ways, to have a relationship with China and the BRICS, and also to have a relationship with the United States. I think that's over. I think that ended this year. And it's now very clear that India has to make sure that it is on good terms with the United States, because it clearly has too many points of conflict with China to be in a truly comfortable relationship with Beijing. So this is a very different kind of Cold War for India. And India is, of course, a more economically significant country than it was back in the first Cold War.
You know, you've made a very important point about India being non-aligned. Do you think believing in multilateralism, being committed to multilateralism, is going to work with India in the future? The reason why I ask is because we have an adversary in Pakistan. We have an adversary in China, a relationship which we are trying to manage. US was a time-tested ally, but because of President Trump's policies over the last few months, some of the foundations of that relationship are now being questioned. It seems that when it comes to crunch time, when it comes to a crisis, you are always fighting alone. Which relationship should India really bet on?
It's pretty hard to have it both ways in the world that we're discussing. And I think the Indian attempt to repeat the non-alignment strategy, or what I call the polyamorous strategy, has basically failed. Rather in the same way that Brazil found itself on the wrong side of President Trump's tariff policy, so did India. And I didn't find that terribly surprising. After all, if you think about reciprocal tariffs, they're supposed to be a response to the high tariffs of other countries. Well, India actually had some of the highest tariffs in the world. If you look back to the beginning of this year, it would have been kind of amazing if President Trump had announced reciprocal tariffs and not hit India quite hard. But I think it came as a shock to the Indian government, which assumed that it had a kind of pretty good relationship with President Trump. President Trump is somebody who can combine good personal relations with world leaders with pretty adversarial policies. And I think this is the thing that makes him quite hard to read. From India's point of view, for the reasons you've given, the problem of Pakistan, the problem of China, which historically has been close to Pakistan, it's very hard for India not to align itself more with the United States than with China. Remember, China now has relationships with Russia, with Iran, and with North Korea, the axis of authoritarians, that in their various ways pose problems for India. Now, India can free ride in some measure, for example, by getting oil from sanctioned Russia, but that's not something that sits well with policymakers in Washington. My view is that it was a mistake for India to boast about having it both ways. And now India finds itself confronted with a stark choice. Are you with the United States? Are you with the West, as we used to call it? Or do you want to be hanging out with the BRICS? And I really don't think the BRICS is the place to be.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferguson, for joining us here for a very enlightening session at the Global Leadership Summit. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Professor Niall Ferguson. Clearly, the world is becoming very, very inward looking. India has no choice but to continue betting on multilateralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ferguson, for joining us this evening. You really made us think differently about what we're facing. And thank you, Parikshit.
Well, our next conversation is about how policy is being reimagined in real time, how data and technology are changing the way decisions are made, and how cooperation between the center and states is shaping India's next growth chapter.